As Kyrgyzstan descends into chaos, Craig Murray explains the background to the violence and why Central Asia demands our attention. It is arguable that the wave of ethnic killings in southern Kyrgyzstan that started last Saturday, which has left hundreds of Uzbeks dead and tens of thousands homeless, is, at root, the fault of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet Union was in theory just that, a union of Soviet socialist republics. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan were three of them. But whatever the theory, Stalin had no intention of allowing the republics to become viable entities, or potential power bases for rivals. So he intervened personally, and the republics were deliberately messed up with boundaries that cut across natural economic units, and severed cultural and ethnic links. The names Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan might give the impression that these Central Asian states are the ethnic home of the Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and Uzbeks. They are quite deliberately not that. For example, the major Uzbek town of Osh, in the Ferghana Valley, which is at the center of this week's violence, is over the border in Kyrgyzstan. The great centers of Tajik culture, Samarkand and Bokhara, are not in Tajikistan, but in Uzbekistan, even though 90% of the population of those cities remain Tajik-speaking, and are now subject to Uzbek government attempts to choke the language. It is a remarkable feature of the latest chapter in the Great Game that the mountainous little country of Kyrgyzstan hosts major bases for both the Russian and the United States Air Forces. Both powers view Kyrgyzstan as occupying a strategically crucial position north of Afghanistan, on the route from Central Asia to China. But neither appears to consider that their security strategy might be enhanced not just by a military presence, but by alleviating the appalling poverty and bad government from which the people of Kyrgyzstan have suffered. Like the other Central Asian states, newly independent Kyrgyzstan fell under the dictatorship of the local Soviet leader. But Naskar Akayev had by far the best of an incredibly poor bunch, and the only one who was not a former member of the Politburo. Kyrgyzstan is severely disadvantaged by its geography. Distance from markets, poor communications and lack of infrastructure are a barrier even to the development of its mineral resources, but Akayev instituted the freest economy in Central Asia, and undoubtedly the least oppressed society. Sadly, time and the enjoyment of power whittled away at Akayev's democratic credentials. Censorship crept back apace. Deepening corruption centered on his children, and it was for the sake of their political futures that he eventually indulged in widespread vote rigging. When Akayev was overthrown in the 2005 Tulip Revolution, he went back to being a scientist in Moscow. This contrasted sharply with the experience of Uzbekistan a few months later. When demonstrations against President Karimov started to gather mass support in Andijan, Karimov unleashed his army, and more than 700 protesters were shot dead. That effectively ended the wave of color revolutions against ex-Soviet leaders. Akayev's replacement in Kyrgyzstan, President Bakiyev, proved worse than his predecessor, in precisely the same problem areas of vote rigging, media control, and corruption. His old democratic allies deserted him, and fought the 2009 election against him. Bakiyev's re-election in 2009, with 83% of the vote, was widely condemned. Bakiyev remained close to the United States. Perhaps to close, his son Maxim was arrested on Sunday in Farnborough, having just flown to Britain. There is an Interpol arrest warrant out for him, focusing on massive contracts allegedly given to him by the Pentagon for supply to the US Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. This appears to be a standard Pentagon method of dealing with Central Asian dictators. In Uzbekistan, the Pentagon handed FMN Logistics, belonging to the dictator's daughter, Gulnara Karimova, a massively profitable contract for land supply to US forces in Afghanistan and structural work on US bases there. Bakiyev was particularly unpopular in the capital Bishkek, though he apparently retained the support of rural Kyrgyz, especially in the south. But 2 months ago, Bakiyev was overthrown in a second popular revolution. The interim leader, Ruslan Otunbayeva, has announced fresh elections, but her government has been overwhelmed by the gathering violence. The ultimate loyalties of the police and army are uncertain at this point. Otunbayeva is a liberal Central Asian, and, as is typical of her generation, that means she looks to Russia. Her interim government has appealed to Russia for military assistance, but received a frosty response from the Kremlin. There had been a concerted campaign in the Russian media against Bakiyev, which undoubtedly contributed to his downfall. Such a campaign would not have been possible without Putin's nod. Bakiyev was viewed in Moscow as too friendly to America. But Otunbayeva is far too liberal for Putin's taste. Russia will be hoping for a strong pro-Russian leader to emerge, and that will be more likely if proposals gain traction for a peacekeeping force from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the regional security mechanism which is effectively a local dictators' club. It would be wrong to characterize the violence in Kyrgyzstan as politically motivated. Ancient ethnic tensions and stereotypes have come to the fore, and poverty is the root cause. But at the same time it is broadly true that the Uzbeks of the south generally support Otunbayeva, while their southern Kyrgyz attackers do not. Bakiyev supporters have played some role in stirring up the violence. To complicate things further, while Russia's Uzbeks may support Otunbayeva, President Karimov of Uzbekistan most certainly does not, seeing her as an embodiment of the dangers of democracy to dictators like him. And Karimov does not want a flood of comparatively more politically sophisticated Uzbeks from Russia entering Uzbekistan. So for 3 days, tens of thousands of Uzbeks massed on the Uzbek-Kyrgyz border, on which Karimov has destroyed most of the bridges, and which is mined and wired for its entire length. Eventually the Uzbek government relented, but let only women and children through. They have been herded in 2 camps, and are not free to leave. Savara, an Uzbek woman I spoke to by phone yesterday, told me she and her family were stuck in their home, in the Frunzskaya district of Ush. She witnessed the destruction of every building in the largely commercial street on which she lives, bar her block of flats. The shops and restaurants, like most Ush businesses, were Uzbek-owned. She told me that she saw 3 distinct groups of masked young men arrive, overseen by militia, in an armored personnel carrier. The first group broke into all the premises, and smashed doors, windows, and fittings. Then a second group came and removed all the stock and furniture. An hour or so later a third group came, and methodically lit fires inside each building. It was, she said, calm and organized, not a violent mob. Savara lives in a block inhabited mainly by Russians. She believes that is why it was not attacked. Yesterday, some Kyrgyz men entered the block saying they were registering people for humanitarian aid. Savara did not answer the door. Her Russian neighbors said the flat was empty, and have been bringing her food. Where is Britain in all this? The ethnic conflicts of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan are inextricably linked with what is primarily an ethnic conflict in Afghanistan. Yet our policy in Central Asia, if it can be called one, is nothing but support for the very dictators who are impoverishing their states. The answer to the growth of Islamic radicalism is not for rival great powers to strive to prop up regional dictators. That approach is already leading to the growth in the kind of radicalism we are trying to suppress. We can no longer afford a short-term policy conditioned by the tactical expediency of securing regional logistic support for the Afghan war. We continue to ignore Central Asia, at our peril.